I'm going to start by introducing you to sleep. Of course, sleep is something that we all have an intimate relationship with anyway, but you might not have thought about the fact that as humans, we actually spend roughly a third of our lives asleep. So we sleep roughly 8 hours a day. I know there's a huge variability in that, and not everyone gets that much sleep, and some people sleep a lot more, but roughly 8 hours a day. And if you think about it, that's much more time than we spend on any other single activity. Dramatically more time. So just the fact that we're investing that much time in sleep should suggest to you that it's doing something incredibly important for us. If we look across the animal kingdom, we find that every kind of animal that we consider actually sleeps in some sense. And there are some really nice evolutionary adaptations to facilitate this. One that I like to flag comes from animals that hibernate, like bats. So you probably all know that when animals hibernate, they do that because there's not much food around, and so they're saving energy by lowering their body temperatures and not moving around very much. But if your body temperature is too low, your brain can't obtain the kind of activity that it needs to do in order to sleep. And so it turns out that hibernating animals actually periodically warm up. So they're investing energy in warming up their whole body in order to obtain sleep. So it's an investment at a time when they don't have much energy. Again, it should convince you that sleep is important. And another one that I really like to flag is in dolphins. I don't know if you can see the pointer. Maybe you tell me if you can't see it. But in dolphins, as you know, are mammals. They have to breathe air to stay alive. So how do they manage to keep breathing when they're asleep? Well, they have evolved split brain sleep. So they sleep with just one hemisphere at a time. And so one hemisphere stays awake, and they keep swimming, and typically they swim in great big spirals. So they swim up, they get a breath, and they swim down again. So it's an evolutionary adaptation just to allow them to sleep. So hopefully, I'm convincing you that sleep is important. Why is it important? What's going on when we sleep? Well, sleep is all about the brain. So I want to debunk right now the myth that the brain just switches off when we sleep. It absolutely doesn't switch off. The brain is very busy when we sleep, and as sleep scientists, we measure this using electrodes. So these are a couple of my students. Actually, I believe this was here in Liverpool years and years ago. A couple of my students who were messing around with these electrodes. We stick them all over the scalp and some on the face, and with that we can pick up tiny, tiny changes in electrical activity in the brain. We amplify them, we put them on the screen, and they look like this. This is called EEG. And if you're not doing much, if you're not being stimulated with a sound or seeing something or moving or anything like that, then your EEG pattern just kind of looks like a bunch of noise from right to left. This is kind of average activity across the brain. Now, as you fall asleep, you go into what we call stage 1. This is a transitory phase of falling asleep. And basically that oscillation up and down just slows down a little bit. But then, if you go deeper into sleep, stay asleep and go deeper, you go into what we call stage 2 sleep, the basic oscillation slows down a bit more, but you also start having these characteristic bursts of high frequency activity that occur locally over different areas of your brain, not everywhere at once. And we call these sleep spindles. So if we've got lots of electrodes on your head, you'll only see this on 1 or 2 channels at a time. We wouldn't see this everywhere. And I'm sort of emphasizing these because I'm going to come back to these sleep spindles a couple of times in the talk. So try and remember, sleep spindles, something that occur in stage 2 sleep, and they also occur when you go deeper into sleep, into a stage that we call slow wave sleep. So this is deep sleep, and it's characterized by these really high amplitude electrical oscillations that we call slow waves. The spindles right on top of the slow waves, you can't see them in here because of the scale, but they are happening there on top. And what causes those huge high amplitude slow oscillations? This is a state of mass neural synchronization. It's really different than anything that your brain can do while you're awake. And it's basically millions of neurons in your brain all synchronizing and firing at the same time, and that will give you a huge peak in electrical activity, and then they will pause together, and that'll give you a trough, and then they fire again at the same time. So they're acting together in synchrony. It's really different than what happens during wake or any other state of consciousness, except some forms of anesthesia. You see this sometimes in anesthesia. Now, if you stay asleep, is that a question?
Yeah, just about sleep. Do you know when you're asleep, do you like lose weight when you're asleep by doing exercise and that?
So what I can say about that is that you do burn less energy when you're asleep, but it's actually not as much less as people think. So I'm not sure in the proportions that you are still burning energy, but obviously it's not like going out and running a marathon or something. You know, you're usually fairly still when you're sleeping. Okay, so if you stay asleep through slow wave sleep, you'll move eventually into, I'm sure everyone's heard of rapid eye movement or REM sleep. And this is the most famous stage of sleep, isn't it? It's probably famous because it has some interesting characteristics. Firstly, if we look at the EEG, you see that mass neural synchrony, those oscillations that I was talking about, are gone. The electrical activity in your brain now looks very similar to the activity during wake. So all different parts of the brain are kind of doing their thing separately. It's not synchronous like it was in the slow wave sleep stage. But also, interestingly, your bodily muscles are all paralyzed. We call that cataplexy. So it's only the eye muscles that are not paralyzed, and those give you those rapid eye movements under closed lids. People have probably seen this a lot in young children and babies because they get a lot more of this stage than adults do, and they can go more directly into it. So rapid eye movement, REM sleep, is still extremely deep sleep. We call it paradoxical sleep because it's deep sleep, but the synchrony is totally lost. I think it's particularly interesting because it looks so much like wake, and yet you're deeply asleep. Okay. Now if we look, and I just put that on there to highlight those sleep spindles again before we go off the slide. So I want you to remember what that looks like, and that it's called a sleep spindle because we'll come back to that. Okay, so if we look across the night of sleep, what we find is that people tend to cycle through these stages that I've told you about multiple times in the night. So here we plot, this is called a hypnogram. Here you've got the hours of sleep across the x-axis and the stages on the y-axis, and we tend to plot REM next to wake just because the electrical activity looks so similar. And what you see is people tend to first move from wake into stage 1. That's the light sleep, the transitory stage. Stage 2, light sleep, then slow wave sleep, and then a bit of REM. So they've had all the stages, and then they go through that cycle again, and then again, and then again. So people tend to cycle through these stages roughly every 90 minutes, and they'll have 4 or 5 cycles in the night. There's a huge variability in that, but that's roughly the sleep structure. And you might also notice here that in the early part of the night, you're getting lots of that deep slow wave sleep and not much REM. And in the late part of the night, you don't really get much slow wave anymore. And we think of that as a kind of a satiation, like your brain was hungry for slow wave sleep. Once it's had it, it doesn't need it anymore, and it can move on to the dessert, which is the REM. So it's a kind of it's very structured, but it's a complex structure. And the reason I'm telling you this is because I want to convince you, we've started by hopefully convincing you sleep is doing something important. Now I'm convincing you sleep, the brain is not switched off. The brain is doing something very complicated and quite precise by cycling through these stages. So it's something about this series of stages again and again and again. That's important. Okay, so what is it actually doing? Why are we sleeping? Why does our brain do this? I'm going to touch on 2 different reasons why sleep is important. By no means is this meant to be comprehensive, so there will be other reasons that I'm not going to talk about. I'm just going to talk about these 2. So the first one I'm going to talk about is restoration and repair. So we know that sleep is very important for keeping our brains healthy. And I'll give you one of my favorite examples of this. Here's a nice, plump, healthy young brain, and it's showing nice slow oscillations. This is actually a cartoon of the slow oscillations, or slow waves from slow wave sleep. But actually, unfortunately, not all brains achieve this. And one of the main times when they don't achieve this is as we age, we start to lose those slow oscillations. And so in most men by the age of 50 and 60, and in most women by the age of 70, those slow oscillations are completely gone. Of course, again, there's huge variability in that. People studying how these slow oscillations gradually deteriorate with age and looking at brain structure have actually shown that that gradual deterioration can predict some of the neural atrophy. So this is a picture of some of the frontal areas where atrophy is predicted by the extent of loss of slow oscillations. So when this study came out, people immediately started thinking, well, what could we do to try and slow that process down? What could we do to help people? Maybe we can engineer the sleep somehow. This is the first sleep engineering example that I'm going to tell you about, in order to slow down this process and keep people's brains healthier for longer. And so, a colleague of mine in Germany, Hongi Ngo, actually developed a method for boosting slow oscillations just by playing sounds to people when they're asleep. And the way this works is, so here you've got your slow oscillation that's just kind of unfolded across the screen. And these yellow arrows are meant to indicate the time when we would hit. We say hit, but we're just playing a sound. The sound sounds like this. It's just a pink noise sound. A brief pink noise sound. If we hit the slow oscillation as it's rising up towards the peak with a sound like that, then what Hongi's team showed, and has been shown again and again since then in labs around the world, is that we can deepen the next trough and heighten the next peak and the next trough and the next peak after that. So if you keep applying these sounds again and again and again across the night, you can actually extend the amount of time that the brain spends in slow wave sleep, and you can actually improve the memory benefit that the person you're stimulating with these sounds gets from that particular night of sleep as well. Okay, so very exciting work, but all done in healthy young people. So in my lab, and I must say lots of other labs around the world, we grabbed on this and we thought, okay, so can we use this sleep engineering in older people in order to boost their slow oscillations, and what will we see with that? So I'm just going to show you. These are data from a group of healthy young people. And what you see here, healthy young people undergoing this stimulation, in green, you see the EEG trace if they were stimulated at the time of this dashed line here, so that they had just a pink noise sound at that time point, and you can see it's making these beautiful oscillations afterwards. This plot is from averaging lots and lots of stimulations across a night. The black line is the sham, so that's where it's a kind of a control where they would have applied the sound, but they didn't. So it's exactly, they identified the time when they would have applied it, but then they withheld the sound, so no stimulation given. So you can see the difference. It's a beautiful kind of increase in those oscillations for the healthy young people, mean age 24. These are university students, right? They're volunteering for these studies. So we repeated this exact study. We went to Germany, to Hongi Ngo's lab. We used everything exactly the same in a group of early middle-aged participants, mean age 56. And this is what we found. So you might feel that it's a bit disappointing, in fact, here. So there is a benefit. These black lines at the top show that there's a significant difference between the black and the red. The red is the stimulated trace and the black is the sham. There is a benefit, but it's puny compared to what's happening in the younger people. And so we were a bit disappointed, and we also didn't find a memory benefit with this. So we were a bit disappointed by this, but this was already quite a few years ago. And what I can tell you is, as a result of this finding, we went back to the drawing board and we thought, okay, how can we improve this stimulation? And we've done a lot of further work looking for the optimal timing, on the peak of the oscillation, when is the exact best time to deliver those stimuli? And also, which oscillations should we stimulate? Because the slow oscillations are all different, and some of them respond better to stimulation than others. And so we've been able to identify both of those things, and we now need to take this back again into a middle-aged group and see whether we can get a stronger result than this. So this is very much a work in progress. We still think this could be a useful treatment for people. And there are at-home devices that people can take into their houses and wear to deliver this stimulation. But we also think that it needs optimization in order to be better, to be genuinely useful. And I can say, I didn't make a picture of it here, but I can just add to that. Other groups around the world have been trying the same thing. And I know of 2 different studies where they were able to show that in participants with mild cognitive impairment, so starting to degenerate towards dementia, they were able to provide a memory benefit with this stimulation. So it's very much something that we're working on. It's not ready, I think, for general release yet, but I think it's an interesting possibility for sleep engineering.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to move on because I want to tell you about another major function of sleep, which is about memory. So this is all about how sleep is important for facilitating our memories. And I like to illustrate this by getting people to do a very simple little task. So if you can all hold up your non-dominant hands, if you're right-handed, that's your left hand, or if you're left-handed, it's your right hand. So I've numbered the fingers there, and I want you to press your finger against your thumb in the order 4, 1, 3, 2, 4. 4, 1, 3, 2, 4. 4, 1, 3, 2, 4. Everyone's trying, so that's good. I know it's hard. The reason I'm getting you to do that is because this is the actual task that was used in this study. And I mean, I think it's just nice for you to see what a simple little task, although it's annoyingly fiddly as well. So what they did in the study is they got people to come into the lab and practice 4, 1, 3, 2, 4, exactly like that, trying to do it as quickly and accurately as they could, again and again and again. And they measured how fast they were doing. And what they find is that people kind of get faster and faster, and then they start to plateau, and then they get bored, and they might drop off a bit, and then they stop them at that point. So they actually, in the study, had people doing this for up to about an hour and a half. Which I know you're glad I'm not going to be allowed to make you do that. So that's the task. And then they gave them a little test. And the test was very simple. 30 seconds, do as many 4, 1, 3, 2, 4s as you can. And they measured how many people did. And this is how many people did. So they did roughly about 21. This is just a cartoon of the data because it's easier to show this way. Then people went away. They came back 10 p.m. They were told not to practice. Very little danger of them practicing, I think. They did have a group that wore mittens, so they couldn't practice. And then 10 p.m., same test. 30 seconds, how many 4, 1, 3, 2, 4s? People didn't really change. Maybe they were a bit less fatigued with it, so, slightly better, but no significant difference. Then they went home, slept at home overnight, and what do you think? They came back 10 a.m. the next day, they did the same test, and what do you think happened? Someone said it went up, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't be showing you, right? Because this is what it looked like. So dramatic, up to 20% improvement across one night of sleep. And this, it turns out, happens with many simple motor skills like this. Many, many skills improve dramatically across a night of sleep. Other kinds of memories just don't decay as much and are protected, but many kinds improve. In this particular study, of course, because they're academics, they were criticized and people said, oh no, it's just because it was the third time they were better, because it was the third time they had more chances to practice. They had a control group that came initially at 10 p.m., had their night of sleep. There you see the improvement across sleep between the first and the second time. Now, interestingly, this improvement, the extent to which they improved across the night of sleep, was predicted by those sleep spindles that I was banging on about when I told you about the sleep stages. And remember I told you that these occur not all over the brain at once, but they occur just in localized areas. So we think that the sleep spindles are markers of something very important that's happening that allows the brain to work on memories while you're asleep. And that's what I'm going to tell you about next, okay? So it doesn't occur everywhere at once, and in this case, the spindles that predicted this were the spindles that occurred over the part of the brain that controls the particular hand. So some of you will know that's the other side of the brain than the hand that you were using, right? Okay, so that's a nice study that illustrates that sleep is important for memory. This is a particular kind of memory, but actually this generalizes to almost every kind of memory. Almost every kind of memory will have a benefit from sleep. So why is that? What's happening in sleep to give this benefit? Well, I think I can finally say that we know. For many years, I would have said, well, we don't really know, but we have an idea. But I think there's enough data now that I think it's fair to say people studying sleep know why this is. And the reason why it is because the brain is actively practicing stuff that we've learned in the day when we're asleep. And we call that replay or reactivation, whatever you want. I call it practicing. And we think that, and that practicing is happening during those sleep spindles. And it's happening in the areas where the sleep spindles are occurring. So I'm going to show you a nice study that illustrates this in humans. This is, it's actually an aerial view of a map of a virtual town. Okay, so imagine that in this study they got people to play a video game where they're running around a virtual town and they're kind of, they're running from the post office to the school to the general store to, the town hall, whatever. And they explore the town, and they're doing this in an MRI scanner, and their brain activity is being recorded. And what I'm showing in this picture at the top is the brain activity while they're doing the task. And it's not surprising that you get lots of brain activity while they do this, and it includes visual areas, it includes associative areas, and it includes a structure called the hippocampus, which is involved in spatial memory. Now, the cool thing in this study is that they then got these people to sleep in the MRI scanner. There are not many studies like this, and they recorded the brain activity when they were in slow wave sleep with those high amplitude slow oscillations that I told you about. And they compared the brain activity of these people who had intensively done this task before they went to sleep to the brain activity of people who did a similar task but didn't have a memory component, no spatial memory exploration component. And what they found is, among other areas, the hippocampus, right here with the blue cross on it, was significantly more active in the people who did the spatial exploration task during their slow wave sleep. And furthermore, when the next morning, they woke them up and they got them to do the A to B, going from A to B as quickly as you can, task again, and they plotted how much faster they got at going from A to B on the x-axis here against the extent to which this hippocampus area activated in slow wave sleep on the y-axis. And they showed that the extent to which that area was active in slow wave sleep predicted how much faster they got. So I really like this study because it's a really nice illustration that a structure which is important for spatial memory is practicing that task while you're asleep, and the extent to which it practices actually predicts how much better you get. So this was a really early study. Now we have a lot more studies showing the same thing with more people, more elegantly, but this was the first, so I like to show this one. Okay, now the plot thickens a little bit because I haven't mentioned anything about sleep engineering with respect to memory, and that's what I'm going to do now. So, it turns out, not only is the brain practicing, and not only is that important for what we will remember, but we can control the practicing. So we can get the brain to practice the things that we want it to practice on demand while people are asleep. And we call this targeted memory reactivation. Targeted memory reactivation. And I'm going to show you how we do this. It's very simple. Imagine I'm getting you to do a task where I show you pictures on the screen, and each picture has a sound paired with it. So I show you this cat in this location, and it has meow. And then I show you this dog in this location, and it has woof. And then tonight, you're sleeping in the lab, and I'm there watching your brain oscillations with the EEG. If I wait till you're in slow wave sleep, which is important, it has to be slow wave sleep, and I play meow, what do you think your brain is going to do?
See a cat.
It's amazing. It's going to do cat. And we know this because we've got ways of getting a fingerprint of what the brain activity looks like when your brain does cat in wake, and then we look at the brain activity after we play meow in sleep, and we can see that it's doing cat. So we see the brain practices, and then we look at, and we know there's a benefit from that. And what I should have said is, if the next morning I then test you on the screen location of the cat and the dog, you'll remember the screen location for the cat better than the dog. And that's because your brain practiced it because I played those sounds when you were asleep. If we check you on that across, so day 1 would be the next morning, 10 days later, 20 days later, what we found is that at least for some kinds of skills, and in this case the data came from the finger tapping task that you did, the 41324, the benefit actually gets bigger out to about day 20, and then it drops off again. So it's not just something that happens the next day and is gone. If we look at your brain activity, we can, when you're doing the task at these time points, again, we can see that the brain activity continues to change as a result of this manipulation, at least until day 10. We've only looked till day 10 with the brain activity. So just playing those sounds in sleep, getting your brain to practice, has long-term effects on the function and the structure. Now, I've got 4 minutes to tell you about the last part.
There's a way to have question time at the end, so you've got it.
Yeah, I think people will want to hear about this. So want to then shift gears slightly, because that was about remembering things better. But actually, as we all know, sometimes we don't want to remember things better. There are some things that we would rather not remember, right? So if you have had a trauma of some kind, then maybe you don't want to forget that it happened, but you would certainly prefer that every time you think of it, you don't have all of those physiological symptoms of pounding heart and sweating palms and all the rest of it, and get really upset and have nightmares. And so that's what happens in people with post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm sure you're aware, have trouble decoupling the emotion from the memory. Now, there is an idea that if you can repetitively practice an upsetting memory in a safe space where you wouldn't have the same emotional responses, then you can decouple it. And that's what this picture is trying to show. It's trying to show how the red part, the emotional part, gets gradually decoupled from the blue part over time. And in this case, it's a theory suggesting that this could happen if these memories are reactivated in REM sleep. Because REM sleep, along with the other characteristics I told you about, is a time when you can't have those kind of physiological responses. Because of the neurotransmitter balance in your brain, you can't have the pounding heart and the sweating palms. And so this theory suggested back in 2009 that if we could get people to practice their upsetting memories in REM sleep, we could help them to decouple the emotion from the memory. Okay, so we decided to try this and to study this. And so what we did is simply, we didn't want to traumatize people, so we just gave people nasty pictures, like a picture of someone getting bitten by a dog or a car crash, something like that. And we paired them with sounds. This would have had some kind of a growling, barking sound with it. We paired them with sounds that made sense with that picture. And then we played half of those sounds in their subsequent REM sleep. So we're reactivating half of the pictures. We asked people to rate how upsetting the pictures were both before sleep and after that manipulation. then indeed the next day they rated the things as less upsetting, less arousing. So we got all excited about this in my research group. It's another form of sleep engineering. It's a way that we could harness the power of REM sleep to maybe help people to deal with trauma memories. And so we repeated the experiment, but we repeated it asking now what happens in the brain and what happens to those, we call them autonomic responses. In this case, we measured heart rate, so your bodily arousal responses. We repeated essentially exactly the same experiment. And what we found when we scanned people's brains in the MRI scanner 48 hours after they initially so they saw the pictures, they rated them, they slept, we triggered the brain to practice half of the pictures, and then the next day we did nothing, and the next evening after that, we put them in the scanner, we showed them the pictures, we asked them to rate the pictures. And that's what this is. We found that the whole salience network, so that's a network of areas in your brain that control your arousal responses, was down-regulated when they were rating, seeing and reacting to, responding to the pictures that had been triggered to practice in REM sleep compared to the ones that we didn't trigger in REM sleep. Okay, so it down-regulated that. In their heart rate, we saw a reduced response to arousal response in heart rate. And in the behavioral ratings, we replicated the original finding that I've told you about. So people did rate the images as less arousing if they were cued in sleep. But this was only the case for the images that had been rated as the most upsetting in the first place. So if people didn't think it was upsetting, then we didn't see a change. Okay? So we got all excited about this. And off the back of this, we have a big program of work for the next 5 years. But I think I'll leave that for you to ask questions about, because otherwise I'll get yelled at for going over time. So thank you very much for your attention.